So good evening, folks. It's nice to see everybody here. It's a crowded house. This is exciting. My name is Jason Kahns. I'm a member of the anthropology department here at UT. Thank you all for being here tonight for what is the last event in our semester-long colloquium on cultures of environmental justice. It's going to be an exciting conversation this evening. Before we get started, I was asked to mention to all of you that there will be another talk here hosted by the Rapoport Center, but not in this room, this Thursday, which may be of interest to some, by Dr. Sinan Antoun, titled Where Wars and Wounds Collide. It will be this Thursday, 5 to 6 p.m. in Towns Hall 2.124. So if you all are interested in that, I would encourage you to go. I'd like to begin this evening with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we'd like to acknowledge the Alabama Coshada, Caddo Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. As this is the last in our series, I also have a few thank yous that I'd like to offer before we get started. I'd like to start by thanking the Rapoport Center and especially its directors, Karen Engel and Neville Hode, for making this series possible. Thank you also to Caroline Hahn for all of the work that you've done in making these talks happen. Thank you so much. And also thank you to Cooper Christensen and Stephen Zygmunt, who can't be here tonight, for assistance in planning and making these series a possibility. This has been great. I really appreciate all of the work everyone's put into it, and I appreciate all of you for being here too. We'd also like to thank the series co-sponsors, Planet Texas 2050, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, the South Asia Institute, Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Teresa Lozano Long Institute for Latin American Studies, and the Departments of Geography, Anthropology, and City and Regional Planning. In particular, we'd like to thank the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies and the Department of Anthropology for their generous support of this evening's talk. So we're privileged tonight to be joined by Dr. Alex Nading. Dr. Nading is an associate professor of anthropology at Cornell University. He's a medical and environmental anthropologist whose research focuses primarily in Nicaragua. He has examined transnational campaigns against dengue fever, bacterial disease, and chronic kidney disease, as well as grassroots movements to address these issues. His first book, the quite well-known Mosquito Trails, Ecology, Health, and the Politics of Entanglement, which came out in 2014 from the University of California Press, was an ethnographic study of the role of Nicaraguan community health workers in dengue fever prevention. He's also written widely on topics including genetically modified mosquitoes, dengue vaccines, the human microbiome, food safety, and the role of toxic chemicals in global health interventions. His second book, which is in progress and from which his talk tonight draws, is tentatively titled, or maybe it's not tentative, I'm not sure, Non-Traditional Causes, Kidney Disease, Climate Change, and Life Support in Nicaragua's Sugar Plantation Zone. It examines how environmental justice activists are addressing an epidemic of chronic kidney disease on Nicaraguan sugarcane plantations. He is the current editor of Medical Anthropology Quarterly, and his talk tonight is titled Social Security, Injury, and Agrarian Futures in Nicaragua's Sugarcane Zone. Following Dr. Nading's talk, Dr. Ashanté Reese will offer a brief commentary. Dr. Reese works at the intersection of critical food studies and Black geographies, examining the ways that Black people produce and navigate food-related spaces. Animated by the question, who and what survives, Dr. Reese's work is focused on the everyday strategies that Black people employ while navigating inequity. Her first book, Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C., takes up these themes through an ethnographic exploration of anti-Blackness and food access. Her second book, Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice, is a collection co-edited with Hannah Garth that explores the geographic, social, and cultural dimensions of food in Black life across the U.S. Currently, Dr. Reese is working on a cultural history of sugar and Sugarland, Texas, in which she explores the spatial, economic, and carceral implications of sugar and the sometimes contradictory and deadly sweetness that marks Black life. So as you can tell from those brief biographies, we're in for an exciting and lively conversation. So please join me, without further ado, in welcoming Dr. Alex Nading.
Thank you, Jason, for that really, really nice introduction. And thanks to Dr. Ashanté Reese for agreeing to come and offer some comments. And also, of course, want to echo the thanks to Caroline for all of the great organizational work that she helped with getting me here, the Rapoport Center, the Department of Anthropology, and the Center for Latin American Studies. It's a real honor to be speaking to this audience. And I want to preemptively apologize to your neck muscles. Some of you craning a little bit. I'll try to be as efficient as I can. So Jason mentioned the broader book project. I don't know what the title really is going to be. It might that's an option. I'm going to talk around the environmental justice movement that a lot of that book is about, and I'll just try to sort of introduce that a little bit here. So the sort of the seed of the book is this epidemic of chronic kidney disease of non-traditional causes, which is sort of the primary clinical name that it gets. And I've been doing research mostly at one of the 4 sugarcane plantations in Nicaragua, which is called Montelimar. The green arrow there sort of points out the general area of where it is. And I've been working with the former workers who are affected by chronic kidney disease, who have been using a sort of well, it's widely used, but still kind of obscure mechanism of the World Bank called the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman Office to try to shed light on this epidemic and try to get attention from the state, the international communities, and of course the corporation to it. And the reason they were able to do this is that just about all of the sugarcane firms in Nicaragua over the last 15 or so years have received multi-million-dollar loans from the International Finance Corporation, the big private lending arm of the World Bank Group, to expand their sugarcane operations. So the context for what I'm going to talk about today is this broader movement. And that's just hopefully a little bit of framing. So since the 90s, really, thousands of Nicaraguan sugarcane workers have died of a novel form of renal failure, this chronic kidney disease of non-traditional causes. It's not related to diabetes. It's not related to hypertension, hence the modifier NT on its name. And a common origin story surrounding CKD-NT says that it was discovered in the health clinic of Nicaragua Sugar Estates Limited, or NSEL, which is the largest of the 4 sugarcane companies in the country. So NSEL is the company that makes Flor de Caña rum, if you've ever tried that. So in 1996, the staff physician at NSEL, a guy named Felix Zelaya, noticed a curious kind of spike in kidney disease in the community surrounding the sugar mill. And so he started systematically testing the blood of NSEL workers for abnormal kidney function biomarkers, particularly the presence of a protein called creatinine. So under normal conditions, creatinine is filtered out of our bodies by our kidneys, but when kidney function deteriorates, the protein leaks into the blood. And so Zelaya used these creatinine counts and other data to calculate each worker's estimated glomerular filtration rate, a number called the eGFR. And the kind of international standard says that if a person's eGFR stays below 60 for a sustained period, that is a sign of the onset of chronic kidney disease. So NSEL and Zelaya eventually generated a database of about 3,000 suspected kidney disease cases at that one plantation. And Zelaya's work gave rise, really, in some ways, to this new diagnostic category, CKD-NT, but it also gave rise to a new management practice. By around the early 2000s, doctors at all 4 of the Nicaragua sugarcane companies were doing these kidney function tests during every harvest, and companies were starting to refuse to employ anybody who showed signs of CKD-NT. So more than 25 years after Dr. Zelaya started collecting data, the disease is still not, though, classified as officially as an occupational disease by Nicaragua's Social Security Administration, the Instituto Nacional de Seguridad Social, or the INS. So this is sort of a picture of the context of what sugarcane production might look like. I didn't take these pictures. I'm not nearly as good a photographer as Kashi, who's pretty amazing. And this is the logo of the INS here. So the INS classifies some CKD&T cases as occupational or laboral, and others as non-occupational or común. So people whose disease is classified as laboral can claim free medical benefits. People whose disease is classified as común cannot. So CKD&T patients and their supporters that I worked with in Nicaragua have long maintained a couple of things. One is that the disease is rife across communities, adjacent to sugarcane plantations, and really people's residences and dwellings are kind of sort of mixed in and around sugarcane stands, which are getting bigger and bigger and more expansive, right? And the other is that CKD is caused by sugarcane production conditions. This is one of the sort of convictions of these groups. And so companies continue to push back against that suggestion that the environmental conditions of production are contributing to the disease. And those conditions, again, kind of signaled here a little bit: heat, extreme heat, dust, agrochemical use, poor quality water, and smoke from burning sugarcane when they harvest it. So there's a lot of tension, in other words, over CKD&T's etiology. But what I'm going to talk about today is not, or at least not directly, about the contested facts regarding what causes the disease. Instead, what I want to do is explore a set of facts that kind of travel along with each case of CKD&T, facts that kind of anticipate its onset and, in some sense, determine the consequences of diagnosis for people who develop the disease. And these are facts about work. So at first glance, the relationship between CKD&T and work seems pretty easy to explain, right? In western Nicaragua, you have sugarcane plantations that are really among the only reliable employers. There's a labor surplus, which means that companies can use things like early detection of kidney dysfunction to cut ties as soon as workers' bodies succumb to the extreme and dangerous working conditions. So to borrow a phrase from the geographer Julie Guthman, contemporary sugarcane workers are valuable to capitalism because they've been constructed as disposable and thus readily left behind when they become sick or less productive. So disposability enables violence by treating workers as if their futures didn't matter, right? So worker disposability has been sort of understood in the scholarship, especially around U.S. agriculture, as a kind of essential, if hidden, element of the production of cash crops, especially monocrops. And of course, disposability has been enabled by all kinds of public policies. So in the U.S., right, Latin American migrant workers are legally excluded from a lot of basic social protections, including Social Security. So worker disposability isn't the same everywhere, right? And it's not actually an inevitable feature of the rise of monoculture or the emergence of post-Fordist global economies. Rather, I think it's a historically constituted social fact, one that can manifest itself in different sorts of ways. So that's what I'm interested in exploring. So a lot of former sugarcane workers in Nicaragua with CKD&T, particularly those whose disease is classified as común, certainly feel abandoned and forgotten. And this sense of disposability emerged, I think, out of a particular historical constellation of efforts that were designed to turn working bodies into subjects of regulation and indeed of care, to create a system of formalized agricultural labor that could at least potentially recognize maladies as laboral, as occupational. So this sense of disposability is actually the culmination of a decades-long process in which the Nicaraguan state sought ways to ensure the future of the rural poor and of the national economy, to use the bureaucratic mechanism of Social Security to make working life legible and governable. So while it's often depicted as a kind of export of modern Europe, Social Security is arguably a Latin American product. In fact, I got this idea from a guy named Manuel Ruiz Arias, who is a former director of the INS, the Nicaraguan Social Security Administration. He actually credits Simón Bolívar for introducing the concept of Social Security to the lexicon of modern government, way back in 1819, some 60 years before Bismarck implemented the social safety net in Germany. So Bolívar argued that a modern state had to protect its most vulnerable citizens across the life course. And so the INS, Nicaragua's social security system, ties entitlements to labor, like most such systems. So work and Social Security are tied together. But work in Latin America has always been much more complex than Social Security systems often treat it as, right? It's never really been presumed to be contained or autonomous or to move independently of other spheres of existence. So in Nicaragua and elsewhere in Latin America, the rural poor have long made labor-based claims as clients to landowning patrons or patrones for social entitlements like food and health care. So these moral economic relationships are still invoked today, if mostly nostalgically, in contemporary agrarian politics. And they even inflect norms of corporate behavior, right? So we're in an age now, right, and sort of one reason why we're all here, right, in which human rights and environmental concerns are unavoidable. So companies, including sugarcane companies, like other corporations, to an extent, they have to acknowledge and express limited degrees of concern for the communities in which they operate. So in its broadest sense, then, work and the social security that it provides entails really a manifold set of exchanges that cross-cut categories of formal and informal, state and non-state, place-based and abstract. So as I'll talk about in the first part of today's talk, over the past century, Nicaraguan political elites have endeavored to forge the nation's economic future using the coupled tools of agro-industrialization and social security. They converted haciendas into industrial farms, and they tried to turn campesinos, or peasants, into workers. And they worked to replace these personalized systems of patron clientage with a standardized social security bureaucracy. So in the second part of the talk, I'll use an ethnographic example to show how the disposability of CKD&T-afflicted workers is less a predictable result of brutal working conditions in the fields than an arbitrary result of this decades-long attempt to use information from hours and weeks of service to creatinine and EGFR counts to define work and to define the limits of work. So as I'll conclude, my point is not that disposability is the result of a Nicaraguan failure to modernize in line with European ideals. And I don't think that disposability is a sign that Nicaraguan industrial agriculture is simply taking on the characteristics of the North American agribusiness system that relies on a disposable migrant labor force. Just as no body is inherently disposable, no disease is inherently occupational. Plantation ecologies are stubbornly complex, despite all the efforts by companies and states to simplify life, to use pesticides and fences and irrigation technologies to separate the valuable monocrop from the weeds and the waste. And people's working lives are also stubbornly complex, despite all the efforts of social security bureaucracies with their precise metrics of time, space, age, and wage to bracket work as a discrete sphere of life. As in other contexts, the results of this effort to render environments and lives into discrete spaces and facts tend to be arbitrary and violent rather than orderly and caring. So in Nicaragua's CKD&T epidemic, the ongoing attempt to stabilize working bodies and working conditions is beset by agriculture and political histories that militate against these clean divisions between work and non-work, field and home, state and corporation. So I'll start with a little story about a guy named Don Alvaro Torres, who was one of the leaders of the workers' movement at Montelimar. And he was diagnosed with CKD&T in 2010, several years before I met him. Back in the 1970s, when he was a teenager, he started working in the sugarcane fields as what was called a cabra. He accompanied an older brother of his cutting cane during the harvest. And so when Don Alvaro was young, the plantation Montelimar was a loose federation of farms, really, owned by Nicaragua's dictator, Anastasio Somoza Debayle. And families like Don Alvaro's considered themselves campesinos. They worked some of their own land while supplementing their incomes with cash wages from sugarcane labor. So Somoza Debayle inherited this plantation and sugarcane mill complex at Montelimar from his father, Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Now, Somoza Garcia was sort of a self-described economic liberal and modernizer. And when he sort of started consolidating power in the 1930s, he reimagined Nicaragua's Pacific agricultural belt as the kind of crucible for the nation's economic future. And so in this future, as Somoza saw it, a nation of campesinos would progressively become a nation of workers, or obreros. So during the 1930s and 40s, Somoza Garcia sort of separated himself from other caudillos, other kind of political strongmen from previous eras, by styling himself not as an oligarchical patron, right, but as the country's worker-in-chief. He liked to call himself the jefe obrero, right? That's sort of how he styled himself. And from the beginning, rural workers were included in Somoza's plans for not only industrialization of agriculture, obviously, but also a modern pension and disability scheme, the INS. So the INS was written into the Nicaraguan Constitution in 1955 under Somoza. Now, Somoza Garcia, the father, was assassinated 1 year after that law was passed. And after his death, his older son, Luis Somoza de Baile, oversaw the transformation of the country's Pacific landscape from this kind of loose patchwork of small and medium-sized farms to this increasingly consolidated series of monocultures. And so they sort of scaled up production of key cash crops with the help of the U.S. government. There was a program that you sort of see here, represented here, called the Nicaraguan Agricultural Technical Service that operated in the 1950s, and then probably the much better known to you Latin America people out there, the Alliance for Progress in the 1960s. They helped grow agro-export in Nicaragua, primarily cotton, as well as sugarcane, tobacco, sesame, peanuts, and coffee. But all these industries continue to rely mostly on seasonal labor and on really long-standing systems of kin-based patronage to recruit and retain that labor. So Nicaraguan smallholders over this period of the 50s and 60s found themselves with less and less land, which made field labor increasingly necessary for survival, if never totally sufficient. And the social security system that the Somozas created really wasn't able to keep up with this growth, and arguably they didn't care. But expanding plantation companies also took advantage, right? They used the seasonality of labor, a very, very low rural literacy rate, and the continued provision of non-monetary benefits like food and medicine to keep a lot of their operations essentially off the books and not reported to the INSS. So throughout this period, most sugarcane workers, like Don Alvaro, started out their working lives as cabras. So one explanation for the use of this term cabra, which means goat, is that goats consume the weeds and the grasses that grow beneath crops like cane. So a human cabra might do some weeding, they might fetch water, and in other ways kind of try to absorb the tremendous physical stress of the job of cultivating sugar, allowing his adult relative, the formerly employed worker, to meet his daily sort of seeding and cutting quota, right? This is piecework. And so sugarcane labor is always physically exhausting, and this piecework system really demands a kind of discipline that field managers, known as capataces, they can't really instill it on their own, right? So the cabra kind of becomes this auxiliary. But to call the cabra a child laborer, I think, is kind of an oversimplification, right? The cabra is sort of subject to the orders of the capataz, but he's also, of course, subject to the orders of his adult relatives. And so this figure, the cabra, kind of bridges the reciprocal, non-capitalist obligations that attend family and kinship with the more exploitative and extractive ones of the factory and the field, right, as these operations are becoming. So the cabra also embodies other kind of murkier dimensions, including extra-legal exploitation, right? He's an informal laborer, so a cabra can't make any claim against a company for injury or for wage theft, as well as these kind of patron-client inflected moral economics, right? So if a cabra worked hard, he could expect a capataz, a field manager, to formally hire him when he did come of age. And when they were formally hired, and when they did become listed on the books of the company and hopefully of the INS, cabras turned into números, numbers. So formalized workers referred to themselves as números. So overnight, a person's future became factored into company and state actuarial figurations about resource investment and risk. So one of the things about giving a talk about Social Security is that most of the images are just kind of crusty old documents, so I really apologize for that. And the blackouts are just trying to protect the names of the people that are listed here. This is the only one that has like names explicitly on it, so that's why it's a little clunky. So within the life history of an individual cane worker like Don Alvaro, two facts about work coexist. Seen as originating in the figure of the cabra, one's status as a worker derives from a kind of entangled existence, right, in which Social Security came from a combination of plantation production and subsistence from small family plots. seen as originating in the figure of the numero, one's status as a worker derived from an autonomous existence, in which Social Security was the result of sort of inputs and outputs of time, wage, and age. Now, Don Alvaro fully expected to take his place at Montelimar as a numero, but in 1979, after more than 2 decades in which campesinos had seen farmland and forest violently converted into monoculture, Somoza actually used the army to basically run people off of the good land and force them onto less desirable land and basically entice them to become obreros, right? And so the Somozas also, of course, captured more and more wealth for themselves, and this came to a head really starting in the 60s. But by 1979, peasants, students, urban, and agrarian workers movements all united under the banner of the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the FSLN, to topple the Somoza dynasty. So this was one of, obviously, the 2 left-wing revolutions in Latin America in the 1970s. So the FSLN's rural policy in the 1980s, though, wasn't unified. It was split between a group of pro-peasant campesinistas, a sort of wing that advocated for the establishment of agricultural cooperatives and sort of the return of the small and the medium-sized family farm, and their kind of protection from industrialization. So the idea that the campesino was going to save Nicaragua was sort of that wing. But the much more influential wing was the de campesinistas, who saw the conversion of the peasant into a worker as a kind of inevitability anyway, and of course industrial agriculture as a desirable engine of economic growth. And so the de campesinistas pushed for things like the nationalization of roughly half of the country's sugarcane sector, and this included Montelimar. So that plantation, Montelimar, was renamed the Ingenio Julio Buitrago. So Don Alvaro eventually secured a formal paying job at the Ingenio Julio Buitrago, not because he was a cabra, but as a reward for his military service in the revolutionary struggle and the subsequent U.S.-orchestrated counter-revolutionary war. But the assumption of the real kind of thought leaders of that wing of the Sandinista sort of junta, the de campesinistas, about the appetite of rural workers like Don Alvaro for sort of embracing industrial state farm work turned out to be overly optimistic. Workers like Don Alvaro demanded access not just to jobs on this new state plantation, but to land. They wanted some of their land back. And so eventually, as a condition of not only their military service, but also their service to this state company, workers at farms like Julio Buitrago were granted land, as well as a 25% stake in the plantation itself. So through the Sandinista revolution and the ideological tension between the campesinista and the de campesinista wings, you have this other kind of more than capitalist dimension entering the frame, right? Social Security now included not only the kin and family ties that help bring new generations of cabras into the workforce, but also the reciprocal obligations between ex-combatants and the state that were born out of the revolutionary moment. So the revolutionary government in the 80s invested in sugarcane in part because of this idea that modernization through industrial monoculture had sort of been cemented into the national development telos, right? But they did this also in part because they knew that plantations were viewed by rural people as sources of stopgap security, right? As places where a benevolent patron might be sought when medical, economic, or other needs arose. So by making workers, if only briefly, vested co-proprietors of state plantations, the revolution kind of actually deepened this longstanding sense that a sugarcane firm's duty of care to its workers extended into the family plot. So Don Alvaro continued to think of the sugarcane complex at Montelimar as something that he could claim, thanks to his work both as a cabra and as a combatant in the revolution, as a kind of patrimony. But this revolution was short-lived. It ended in 1990. And at that time, nationalized plantations like Julio Buitrago were sold to private buyers. So this is a clip from a consulting report by Price Waterhouse, which was brought in to figure out what to do with all these state farms. And one of the things they recommended was that, okay, so we can maybe ask these workers at these farms if they would like the option to invest 25% in the company and continue to be part owners. So there was a sort of way in which this thing that the workers had construed as something that they had earned became a kind of investment opportunity for them. They could buy in, basically, at the ground floor of what would become another private concern. And actually, the post-revolutionary government, in the kind of the sort of dismantling of the revolution, did try to avoid the re-entrenchment of the same old Somocista oligarchy by trying to formalize the land rights of ex-combatants like Don Alvaro and his family, and a lot of other people who had gotten land back after the sort of the cotton and sugar and sesame and peanut boom of the 60s. So within a few years of this document, which is circa 1991-92, that 25% stake that workers sort of thought that they had earned was quickly and conveniently forgotten. So these farms were sold, and it really wasn't until the early 2000s that some of the men and women who worked at Julio Buitrago when it was a state farm got very, very small payouts in recognition of the plantation sale. But Don Alvaro and his neighbors still talk about that sale as sort of the theft of a revolutionary gain by these rich bankers and these political leaders. So Montelimar changed hands twice, actually between 1993 and 2000, when it was finally purchased by the current owners, which are this conglomerate called the Nicaraguan Shipping Consortium, or NAVINIC. It's kind of confusing, but so there were all these changes of ownership, which made establishing chains of responsibility for worker welfare actually much more difficult over the course of the 1990s. So NAVINIC continued to hire field laborers from the surrounding communities, but it increasingly relied, as most other companies did, on a series of rotating subcontractors. And those subcontractors had a much easier time failing or forgetting to report weeks of work and submit payments to the INSS. So during the 1990s, enrollment in the Social Security system among rural people plummeted from a high of 75,000 during the revolutionary period to around 3,000 around the year 2000, which is sort of the low. And 3,000 is the same number as the total number of suspected kidney disease cases that was compiled at that one plantation in SEL by 2001. So a lot of the workers that were seasonally employed by sugarcane firms unknowingly were not paying into the national social security system, even if the pay stubs and reports they collected from this revolving cast of subcontractors said otherwise. And they wouldn't actually become aware of this often until they became too sick to work. So that's really all this is trying to render is the sort of picture of what work looks like according to an EATS report. So here are the employers, and there's several different ones listed for this particular worker. And then these are the months in which the person worked and the number of weeks in which they actually paid what's called a cotización, which is their contribution. So you can tell it's quite intermittent, which means it takes a long time to accrue enough weeks paid in to expect benefits back. So this kind of situation isn't really that unusual. Actually, especially since the 1990s across Latin America, there's been this assumption on the part of entities like the World Bank and sort of governance organizations that formalizing agricultural labor would be this pathway to real social security, right? So there's actually a lot more regulation over whether workers who work even seasonally in farms are paying into benefit systems. But one really impressive, to me at least, sociological study sort of showed that this actually may increase precarity because it's so hard for a person to piece together relationships with multiple different kinds of workers, even if they've literally gone to the same fields year after year to do the same jobs. And so just sort of, a retired worker that I talked with explained it in a little bit more of a kind of a familiar way. He said that in his youth, right, if you had a problem like an illness or a missing paycheck or even a missing EATS record, you went straight to the plantation administration and you dealt with the administration. But by about 20 years ago, by the early 2000s, right when this disease sort of started emerging, the existence of these subcontractors was making access to administration much more difficult. So he said, no hay patrón, there's no patrón. There's no patrón because the contractor doesn't know who you are. At best, you're just a número. So I want to talk a little bit about what this feels like when somebody gets this disease. So Don William Orozco and his wife, Doña Cintia, lived in a settlement on a hillside halfway between the Pan American Highway and the Pacific coast. So William was actually in his late 40s in 2012 when he first showed signs of kidney disease. And this was actually pretty late in life by comparison to other people with the condition. It tends to strike more often when people are in their 20s and 30s. And in fact, William had almost been working at Montelimar long enough to officially retire. So legal retirement age, which is regulated by the Social Security Administration, it varies in Nicaragua. And sugarcane workers at that time could actually begin collecting benefits through the INTS at age 50, right? So if he got to that age, Don William would be able to retire and at least collect that retirement. And having a connection to the INTS is really important, right? Because Nicaragua has a two-tiered healthcare system. So we have a national Ministry of Health that runs public clinics and referral hospitals, and every citizen has a right to use those, whether or not they're formally employed or not. But if you are formally employed and you are paying into the INTS, if you are paying those weekly cotizaciones into your accounts, and your employer pays a matching sum, of course, just like any other payroll taxes, when you get injured, when you retire, when you reach old age, you get care through a network of kind of semi-private hospitals and clinics that are pretty much uniformly considered to be superior to the public ones through the Ministry of Health. So the INTS is a fragile institution for several reasons. The most obvious one is demographic. So the size of Nicaragua's informal workforce, or so-called informal workforce, the cash-based workforce, continues to dwarf the size of the workforce that pays into the system. So a 2017 report from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimated that about 80% of Nicaragua's workforce did not pay into the INTS. And since that low of almost just 3,000 workers enrolled around the year 2000, because of sort of pushes by the World Bank, the IMF, and others, there's actually been pushes to get more people enrolled. First of all, to regularize what's going on in formal businesses like plantations and factories, but also to grow the INTS client base by encouraging people who were outside that formal workforce to contribute voluntarily. But there's still a disparity. And so the INTS, the solvency of the INTS has constantly been a political question, and that's not surprising. It's not even very unique for Nicaragua. And it hasn't been helped, of course, by the fact that successive governments, left and right, have raided its reserves for short-term giveaways to loyalists. And if you follow your Nicaraguan news, you know that in April 2018, partly as a result of this chronic instability, the government of Daniel Ortega, encouraged by the IMF, proposed a hike in the INTS employee contributions, a raise in the retirement age, and a reduction in retirement benefits. And in the wake of those proposals and several other things, a simmering opposition to Ortega's government kind of boiled over, and Nicaragua fell into a national political crisis marked by weeks of public protests, severe reprisals by the national police. Hundreds of people were killed, and thousands more were jailed, and the country really hasn't been the same since. So William and Cynthia were well aware of the vicissitudes of Nicaraguan Social Security. Workers like William actually kept documents like these, documenting the number of weeks that they had been employed, and stacks of pay stubs documenting their pay-ins to the system as sort of assiduously as they kept any other thing in their house, right? People used to often say the two things you could find were copies of cotizaciones and sachets of instant coffee. Like those are things you could find in people's houses. So at the Montelimar Company Clinic, William's kidney function was assessed throughout the 2012 growing season when he started to feel sick. And that was typical, right? He'd done that a lot of seasons before. And the thing about CKD-NT is that it's a progressive disease, so it's actually difficult to pinpoint when it starts. So these creatinine and EGFR tests and estimates can vary from clinical visit to clinical visit. So what that meant in practice was that when workers started to show signs of renal distress, they could actually take short sick leaves, and if their values stabilized, they could actually go back to work in the fields. And so, creatinine is not something that just goes in one direction. It can actually stabilize. So like a lot of workers who were eventually diagnosed, this is exactly what William did. He would sometimes get a few days of leave and then sometimes feel better and test better and come back well enough to work. So he and his wife Cynthia held out hope that if he could be employed for just a few more months, he could collect that full retirement benefit from the INTS once he turned 50. And if he could stay employed, being a continued employee would also make it much more likely that if he did end up being diagnosed with CKD-NT, that the Social Security Administration would choose to classify his condition as occupational or laboral. For William's CKD&T to be considered laboral, right, he not only had to have the disease, he had to meet a few other basic criteria, right? He would have had to have worked at Montélimar for at least 2 years. He would have had to have worked at least 26 consecutive weeks during that time. And he would have had to show a total of 150 weeks of documented work. So the bar for being considered a worker was actually set fairly high, and the World Bank had some responsibility for those particular rules, and I can talk about why in Q&A if you'd like. So for a worker who had a series of subcontractors as their employers, establishing those facts was exceedingly difficult. But William was actually one of the fortunate ones. He had been working there so long that he actually had irrefutable proof that he was a bona fide Montélimar worker. But if William was laid off before he reported his CKD&T case to the INS, it would be much more likely that it would be classified as non-work related or commun. So people whose disease was classified as commun could still get disability payments because they were too sick to work, but they would have to get medical treatment through the public system and not through the better INS system. So this meant that people whose CKD&T was deemed commun would have to spend their own pension money, right, on treatment. So these terms laboral and commun are in part statements about different kinds of futures, right? The futures workers can expect during work, and the futures they can expect when work ends. So in the legal language of the Nicaraguan Labor Code, a workplace injury is what's called a riesgo laboral, right? A clear, calculable risk, right? An event that might probably happen to a certain percentage of workers, right? But CKD&T is clearly not the same kind of risk as like slicing your finger open on a piece of machinery, right? There's symptoms, but there's no discrete accident. There's really no blood spilled. So these terms, laboral and commun, are also statements about the futures of corporations and government institutions, right? Companies like Montélimar need to get workers with suspected CKD&T off their books in order to make it less likely that INS doctors would be tempted to classify their conditions as laboral, right? So it was one thing for pretty much everybody in the sugarcane zone to assume that this kidney disease was caused by industrial sugarcane production. But it was a very different thing to underwrite that general kind of sense of opinion in the official records of the government social security system. So as long as mortality and morbidity records on CKD&T remained ambiguous on the classification of disease, sugar companies could limit their liabilities, both to workers but also to their shareholders and to a public image, right? And the INS, of course, financially strapped, actually can't possibly cover every case of CKD&T as if it were an occupational disease. It would break the system. There are thousands of people with this disease. So this causal ambiguity really benefited the system as well. So futures were kind of determined through the surveillance of workers' bodies of workers like William. So he continued to experience kind of intermittent spikes in his creatinine levels, and for most of that season in 2012, he kept managing to recover. But the last exams that the company doctor sent William to get, his wife Cynthia remembered in our interview, had to be done in Managua at a particular laboratory. So the company took him in a microbus. They must have had some kind of arrangement, she said, because they sent a group of them, not just William. And at that laboratory, Don William and a group of his co-workers underwent more blood, more urine testing, and then they piled back into the microbus to go to another laboratory for kidney ultrasounds. And with these exams, Cynthia said, they were able to certify that William had the disease. They had diagnosed it here at the plantation, but there they confirmed it. So 10 days after that trip to Managua, Don William and several others who were on that bus were laid off. And what Doña Cynthia still couldn't get over was the excruciating slowness of the experience. For months, William had been faithfully reporting back to the company clinic, hoping that his kidney values would stabilize. But in the end, what they experienced was a certain kind of disposability. Everyone they fired was left outside, in the air, Cynthia said, with no help, no support from anyone. And in the interview recording, I'm clearly confused, right? Surely the company would have wanted William to at least be able to retire comfortably, right? So why didn't they do this? And Doña Cynthia said, of course they know, right? They know how old the workers are, and they know how many cotizaciones they have. The company knows perfectly well who's close to retirement and who isn't. And she said, in fact, I went and I told them, look, why don't you just let him work these 2 months just until his retirement? She and William had actually heard, as I had, that a handful of CKD&T patients who worked under field managers or sector engineers who were known to be particularly generous had been able to petition for like low-stress jobs over those final few weeks to make it to retirement so that they could qualify for the full pension. And so that arrangement was anything but guaranteed, but the possibility that a beneficent upper manager, for all intents and purposes a kind of patron, might ally with workers against state austerity remained a really compelling reason to keep going back to the company, right, rather than to blame it alone for the disposability. So Don Williams' CKD&T was eventually classified as común, and I want to tell his story not because it's typical of all cases that were classified like that, but because it's one of several versions of a worker's itinerary through the company, the INS, the clinics, and the medical system. Disposability was not a given fact of sugarcane work. It was one possible outcome. And so when I talked with CKD&T affected workers and their families around Montelimar, several of them concluded their accounts of their journeys through the INS by saying something to the effect of, and they gave me an enfermedad común, or, and they gave me an enfermedad laboral, right? So it was as if these disease classifications, which you might expect to be kind of forensic or technical facts, were instead the end results of some kind of long-term exchange. And why shouldn't they be, right? After all, social security systems like the INS rely on mutual contributions by workers and employers who expect the state to provide care in return. And what circulates in these exchanges isn't just labor and money, but ideas about time, about kidney values, birthdays, and the nature of the relationship between labor and management. So questions about what counts as a workplace injury turn out to be questions of exchange. And answering those questions entails not only the careful collection of kidney values and cotizaciones, but also the mobilization of kin and family networks, right? The same networks that produce the cabras who later become números. So what felt violent about this situation wasn't just the arbitrariness of disease classification, but the arbitrariness of the company's decision to either help or fire certain workers. So the bureaucratic arbitrariness of the INS blended in unpredictable ways with the arbitrary patriarchal benevolence of the plantation management. So David Graeber has argued that bureaucratic procedures are invariably ways of making social situations that are founded, of managing social situations that are founded on structural violence. And I think a close look at the bureaucratic itineraries of sugarcane workers and the life-altering difference between laboral and común reveals what Graeber calls violence's capacity to allow arbitrary decisions, and thus to avoid the kind of debate, clarification, and renegotiation typical of more egalitarian social relations. So Doña Cynthia was far from the only spouse who would go and petition the company for reconsideration. And people who could afford it would get family money together and scrape together resources to hire lawyers to plead their cases, even with the INS, to try to get classifications reversed. And some of them succeeded, right? Some people could convince an INS official to change that classification. And some people could convince a field manager to let them eke out the last few weeks of work before retirement. The problem, and here is where I think I would nuance Graeber's point about arbitrariness a little bit, was that the chance of entering into that kind of egalitarian relationship, right, with either the state or management was just as random as the chance of getting a technical decision of laboral or común. So I'll wrap up now. So even knowing the risk of CKD&T, people in the sugarcane zone continued to take jobs in the harvests, knowing full well that there was a really strong likelihood that the work was going to shorten their lives. Like Don William, many continued to return to work because the plantation was their primary source of medical attention. That's a really important part of life, right? The best way to learn facts about your body is to go to work and put your body to the test, because at least you get to go to a medical clinic. So, but to presume that they were simply exploiting themselves because they didn't have any other choice, I think would be a mistake. I think that complex, more than capitalist relations, including the kinds of egalitarian ones that Graeber talks about, are essential to the persistence of industrial monocrops. And they're essential to the recognition of the pathologies that monocrop production causes. So in the Nicaraguan sugar industry, the existence of cabras, the memories of that 25% stake in the state farm, the revolution itself, I think are as important as kidney values and cotizaciones in the explanatory frameworks for understanding diseases like CKD&T. Sugar corporations and workers remain entangled in obligations of care that exceed their increasingly streamlined industrial design. But is CKD&T an occupational disease? Clarity on that fact seems like it would have meant a great deal to Doña Cynthia and Don William. Ever since Dr. Celaya began tracking the disease back in the 1990s in sugarcane laborers, CKD&T science has been consumed by this question, its occupational status. And the stakes of that answer seem really, really high, not least for the sugar industry in Nicaragua and elsewhere, right? Because worker disposability, right, if that's what's going on here, is supposed to depend on labor surplus, right? That's just always going to be people willing to do strenuous and dangerous work. But if sugarcane workers or potential sugarcane workers start dying in such numbers, surely the industry is reaching what some CKD&T scientists see as a social and ecological tipping point. Surely there's limits to worker disposability that this disease, now that it's sort of recognized worldwide, is going to reveal. So distinctions between occupational and non-occupational are supposed to be helpful. Because if it wasn't possible to tell whether an illness was work-related, or if there weren't a legal way to categorize an injury as the result of industrial negligence, workers would be even more disposable. But what counts as a work-related condition is not a given. It's always been historically contingent. So I think the case of CKD&T illuminates some of the limitations of both the modern corporate state welfare complexes that aim to deal with the problem of workplace injury and the conventional critiques of those complexes. So the twin fragility of social security systems and industrial production systems has been characterized as a hallmark of the epoch of what Kim Fortune calls late industrialism, or what Ulrich Beck, who sort of mobilizes this very old and kind of problematic trope of Latin American backwardness and lack, calls Brazilianization, right? So in very different ways, Beck and Fortune characterized the contemporary period as a time when the autonomous, atomistic existence of substances and facts and bodies is coming into question, at least in those pockets of the Euro-Atlantic world where people may have once found stories about that kind of autonomy convincing. And when that fiction of autonomy starts to erode, new pathologies arise, right? Long COVID, cancer clusters, endemic asthma, multiple chemical sensitivities, chronic kidney disease. So economic, industrial, and state fragility are refracted back onto bodies in the form of more precarious conditions, more injuries, and fewer options for preventing them, or so the thesis goes. But for agricultural workers in Latin America, the atomistic, autonomous existence of things and people and economic institutions was never a given. What's violent here isn't the breakdown of a stable autonomous existence, but the effort to will the imaginary of autonomous existence into a matter of fact. As much as monocrop agriculture can be caricatured as this kind of animated force that aspires to occupy more and more land and consume more and more bodies, monocrop agriculture depends upon the idea that it too has limits, that there's a space that lies beyond it, that there always is a space where illnesses just happen. And that idea is actually underwritten by the social security schemes that are designed to protect agricultural workers and communities that surround agricultural operations as if they were just like any other kind of worker, and to draw clear boundaries around what counts as work. So the presumption that CKD&T has to eventually become just one kind of problem, laboral or común, and that kind of settlement would equate to some kind of justice or some kind of resolution is, I think, part of the broader set of simplifications on which monocrop production relies. As Nicaragua's social security system struggles for solvency, workers make appeals for justice and for health care based less on liberal notions of autonomy than on an insistence on the ongoing entanglement of flesh and environment, on the persistent blurriness of the divide between the occupational and the non-occupational. This is where they live, right? So this means that the question of whether CKD&T is occupational or not, while epidemiologically important and interesting, is overly narrow. What produces violence here is the fragility of the division between occupational and non-occupational, and the lengths to which the state and capital interests go to preserve it. Thanks.
If you could speak, if you could send the podium to the microphone.
All right. Alex, thank you. There's a lot to think about and talk about, and I will try to make it broader than my own kind of selfish intellectual interests. So and I can send you these notes so you don't have to write them down.
Okay.
So there are a lot of different points that come up, some that I'll elucidate here that got me thinking. But the very first thing from reading your paper and then also listening to you talk about it today is that the plantation as a concept, but also as a space, still structures life and death. And that plantation regimes, we lose something when we only think about them as spatial constructs, because those regimes exist in the air beyond the kind of boundaries of the plantation itself. And when thinking about that, I was thinking about Catherine McKittrick's work, Plantation Futures, and specifically the ways that she tries to help us understand the way the plantation tracks from the kind of what we might think of as the historical plantation during chattel slavery to the city, to the prison. And I would say by extension with your work, I thought about the body, the way the plantation itself starts to live in the body. And there seems to be a kind of triad here between the sugar companies, the state social safety nets, but also then the social and cultural values that are mobilized by workers themselves, values of kinship, values of care and reciprocity. And it got me to thinking about, I don't know if you are familiar with her, but Pavitra Vasudevan. She's a professor here at UT and African Diaspora Studies. And her work is based in the US, but she does work on company towns. And one of the things that thinking about your work and thinking about her work together made me think about is the violence of care itself. How we think about care, and often care is under-theorized as something that is innately good. But what I see in your work is that we can also think about how these triads, companies, state social safety nets, and then also the values that are embodied by workers, can be mobilized by companies to create a kind of violent infrastructure that then undermines one's own autonomy of their bodies, but also one's status as a whole being and not just a worker. Which brings me to another thing that I was thinking about when reading your work, which is this transformation from whole person to body. And you talk about this in terms of working conditions, not just the conditions where people are working, but the totality of the moment and the structures that create the conditions that then transform one's subjectivity from whole being to body. And for me, that's a really important kind of set of theorizations that you're working with, because it almost, for me, it took me back to the historic plantation structures that were, yes, about labor, but also about a certain kind of dehumanization. That brings me to Sylvia Wynter's work that is based on a certain conception of the human that doesn't include what you're talking about here as disposable workers or disposable bodies. So that's something I actually would love for us to talk a little bit more about, how disposability is connected to a certain idea of humanness and a definition of humanness that workers are not being included in. So there's I'm going to say all the text that came to mind when I was reading this first, and then I'll come back to some other thoughts. So when you talked about non-traditional causes and what this distinction between something that is caused by work, disease that's caused by work, and disease that isn't caused by work, it brought up for me what I think is now considered a pretty important text in public health, Williams and Collins, Racial Residential Segregation, a Fundamental Cause of Racial Disparities in Health. And I love that piece, and I still teach it today, because what they're asking us to do is to ask a different set of questions, which is, I think, what you're asking us to do, that if we continue to kind of operate in this binary, what's work-related, what isn't work-related, we actually miss a set of other fundamental causes that are bigger than that. And not only do we miss it, we miss this idea that the boundaries between work and non-work don't actually exist, especially when people are living on the perimeter of the plantation itself. A couple of questions that came up for me while I was reading it is, one of the arguments against classifying this as occupational hazard, or at least telling us why it's insufficient, I think you kind of do this implicitly, but I want to name it for us, is that you're also making an epistemological argument around what counts as evidence. And then I wrote this question in the notes of your paper: how many bodies have to accumulate before something counts as occupational? And what I hear in your work is that that's a moving target. it's a shifting number, it's a shifting metric. And if it's shifting, then there's always people who are going to kind of get lost in the cracks. Thinking about just the spatial configuration of the plantation in Nicaragua, I was curious. I wanted to hear more. I would love to hear more about the relationships between Nicaragua and what we know as Bates and the Dominican Republic. That's a selfish interest because I've been doing a little bit of work in the Dominican Republic. So I would love to hear more about that, and how, at least from my limited knowledge so far, there's the kind of Bate work kind of distinction, but there's also like joy and pleasure that in the Bate that really messes up how we think about the plantation regime as only a death-making regime. And so I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about workers' relations to joy and pleasure, in particular how sugar shows up in that. And so one of the things that I'm working through in my own work is trying to write about sugar as a product of racial capitalism and sweetness that is something inherent to Black life. So I'm curious if there are any constructions like that in Nicaragua. I was also thinking about Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who says capitalism's job is to save capitalism, as you talked about these different transitions of ownership and how workers are positioned in the plantation. And then I also wanted to know, so Amy Moran Thomas's book, Traveling with Sugar, which I'm sure you already know, I think there's something about the way that she's using traveling there, like sugar as a product travels, but also sugar, kind of a colloquial name for diabetes, how it's traveling in people's bodies. I wondered if there are any euphemisms like that in Nicaragua that you might talk about. Okay, I feel like I've been talking a long time. So let me just offer like two more things. One is there's a quote from the written paper that you said, what if the continued recurrence of questions about whether and when agricultural labor is dangerous is itself a political technology? I would love to talk a little bit more about political technology. I've been talking about sugar production as a carceral technology, so I would really love to think about the political in relation to the carceral in relation to surveillance. And then you noted that this is, you use the term more than capitalist history, which I really, really love. And I think, for the benefit of people in the room, maybe we can unpack that a little bit more. And then this is the last thing I'm going to offer here. Two more things. So you also talk about the sacrifice. Their work, many workers talked about their work as a sacrifice to the plantation. And I recently wrote about sugarcane work as a sacrifice on the altar of capitalism. And I really would love to talk a bit about how sacrifice gets framed and used both in positive, not positive, but like how it gets used and taken up in kind of like a production of cultural norms, but also in this other way. And then my last question is about your larger project, which is, I think, connected to this chapter. To what extent is your framing of environmental justice a gesture toward decolonized or decolonial futures? And how does that relate to how this chapter is situated in the larger book? So those are my questions. Oh, no, one more. I would not be a good gender scholar if I didn't ask this. I was very, very caught up by your use of Doña Cynthia's story about petitioning the company representatives. And I wanted to know, to what extent is this a form of gendered labor that is not only normal but expected from wives, sisters, aunties, etc. in these spaces? So I'll stop there. Okay. And I will send you these comments.
Thank you.
Okay.
So should I respond to it?
Your call. Absolutely.
Right. Why don't I do that, and then maybe, I won't take up much more time, taking up plenty of time, but those were such generous comments. I'd like to respond at least briefly and just kind of give you a sense of some of the things that I have thought about, and then acknowledge the things that I need to think about more. So one of the things I need to think about more, I really like the idea of the way that the plantation system lives on in the body, and it's such a there's so many dimensions of how the sort of steps that go from the system of sugar production under chattel slavery to the labor systems that then follow on from that in, say, United States and Louisiana and Texas, to the rather late onset of sugar production in Nicaragua. So really doesn't get going until the late 19th and early 20th century, really in earnest. But one of the connections and one of the ways in which I like to think about what a plantation is, and the reason why I think this is an appropriate term in this context, is that campesinos, right, some of whom identify as indigenous and some of who don't, have, since before the inception of sugar production in Nicaragua, been racialized, right, and been thought of as fundamentally different kinds of humans from the largely sort of Criollo, European-oriented landed oligarchs, right? So there was this way in which, and I talked about this with some of the students this afternoon, going back into the, some Nicaraguan historians have gone back into like the 1860s and 70s, right? Not too long after like the 1848 revolutions, because of course they were all oriented to Europe. And deciding these indigenous people and these campesinos, they're potential communists, right? We need to figure out something to do with them, right? And they didn't initially get the idea that we'll start these industrial farms. What they sort of decided that we needed to do was to sort of make sure that they could establish themselves as the sort of the stopgap sort of security of last resort, right? In other words, to act as patrones. And there was this sort of difference of opinion among the elites about what it would imply for the relations between the largely sort of whitened elite and the racialized rural people if Nicaragua was, as Somoza wanted to do, sort of reorienting its economy to export and really trying to become a global player. So there's a lot that goes on there. And of course the accretive effects of these kinds of production systems really matter too. So in the larger book I talk about the way in which during the cotton boom, Nicaragua was sort of this aggressive user of agrochemicals and pesticides, and there's almost no suggestion or even attempt, not that it would be particularly easy, but it's not really a thinkable question to talk about a disease like this that's recently emergent as the accretive effect of DDT, malathion, all of these, just sort of soup of toxic chemicals that are basically made this landscape into a completely deforested toxic desert where sugarcane is about the only thing that will grow viably. So that's really interesting. And then on the conception of the human and the kinds of humanness, I mean, I think one of the things that this whole situation really points to is the way in which this real paradox that there's this offer, and it's a duplicitous offer that if you work, then you get to be human, right? So I think a good example of that is that you have to work in order to get health care, right? You sort of have to present yourself in that way in order to be recognized as somebody who's deserving of care. But of course, there's always a chance that that still won't be good enough, right? And so that humanness paradox is really important. The other thing I really would love to continue to think about is the epistemological argument about what counts as evidence. So narrative evidence obviously doesn't carry as much weight. And the way in which, the evidence that is being collected now, right, some of these pictures, the Kashi pictures that I showed at the beginning of the talk, actually come from his documentation of an attempt to protect workers from developing this disease. So there's tons of data on now, not just kidney biomarkers, but what happens when you provide people with protective clothing, provide them with water, rest, and shade. Can you stop the disease from starting in this context? So funnily enough, the companies are willing to allow that kind of research to happen because it protects workers. But I'm arguing in the book that really that's a way of protecting industrial sugarcane from climate change, right? So the whole thing is about rising heat and diminished water supply. So I think that the worker then, again, becomes dehumanized in the sense that they matter as a body that is a part of the industrial production of sugarcane. Because when you talk to farmers, what do they care about? Labor, water, and energy, right? And so those are the things that matter there. So then on joy and pleasure and sweetness, in Nicaragua, sugar and the consumption of sugar is a source of all of those things, right? Sweetness both in the flavoring sense and in the kind of metaphorical sense. And so it is, I don't think, lost on anybody that this crop that is the cause of so much pain and so much violence, is also the source of a sort of everyday kind of quotidian pleasure. And in that sense, the entanglement that people feel with sugar production is affective, not necessarily towards the crop, but towards the refined product that it produces. And of course, at the same time, you know, the really, in part of the book, I talk about the ambivalent pleasures that derive not only from sugar consumption, but from rum consumption, and the ways in which that form of palliation, I would argue, can be a form of resistance to the logics of healthcare and of sort of submission to these always inadequate corporate and state systems of care. Amy Moran Thomas and sugar. So the euphemism for CKD&T is actually creatinina. The euphemism is not the sugar, it's the waste protein that's circulating in people's blood, because everybody kind of keeps track of those things. So a lot of times people will refer to the disease as creatinina. There's a little bit of interchangeability with diabetes there, but this is not azúcar. This is not diabetes, and people know the difference. So we definitely need to talk more about political technology and carceral technology. I got that idea of political technology, I think, from Tanya Murray-Lee's and Pujo Semedi's most recent work on plantations, and the ways in which that the establishment of these kinds of monocultures sort of both creates and limits certain kinds of political possibilities. And I think what's interesting to think with in the context of this is the way in which that political technology is layered on top of other ones, like the state farm, like the largely kind of nostalgically remembered and probably never really existing patron-client system of mutual obligation. I think these are all different kinds of political technologies. And I think to the extent that people are kind of trapped in place, right? There's a way in which you might construe this system as something that kind of but binds people to land and to production in certain ways. So sacrifice, I think, is another dimension of that more than capitalist way of thinking. So when I say more than capitalist, I'm talking about economic relations that exceed or go beyond exchanges of money for work or money for commodities, to think about those relationships of gift-giving or long-term reciprocal obligations. But I'm really thinking with the geographers J.K. Gibson Graham, they have this sort of concept of diverse economies that includes not only those nice things like gifts, but also things like extra-legal exploitation, up to and including enslavement, and the ways in which states or powerful people sort of co-opt economic resources in ways that are often quite licit, to sort of try to expand our understanding of what an economy is. But in the book, one of the framing devices is this idea not only of sacrifice, but the larger idea of the blessing. The name of the group that I worked with at Montelimar is the Montelimar Blessing from God Association, the Asociación Montelimar Bendición de Dios. So they use this sort of Christian invocation of the blessing, right, in really kind of interesting ways. And a lot of the sort of ethical and moral claims they make towards the company are kind of trying to refuse the transactional logics of making up for a harm that was done in the past, probably by somebody else through money or through the provision of resources. And I think there's really something interesting to think about in that idea of the unreturnable sacrifice, or the undeserved blessing, right, which does come from a kind of Christian framing of giving and receiving, for thinking about climate change, right? That some of the things that capital produces, right, are these things that are not really answerable and not really sort of commensurable with kind of offset activities, right, like protecting a few workers from heat exposure. Because the dirty secret of this whole industry is that there are actually fewer and fewer workers required to produce industrial sugarcane, thanks to glyphosate, which is now the ripener of choice in the industry, thanks to better mechanization, which is coming to Nicaragua. So what will happen in the not too distant future is that even though people will continue to get CKD&T, nobody will qualify under the terms of how long you have to work and how many weeks you have to have been registered as a worker to qualify for those occupational benefits, at which point it won't matter what kind of disease it is, because there won't be enough workers getting sick. And the ones that are working will be protected just enough so that if they do get sick, there's no way it could ever be blamed on the company. So there's a shrewd way in which this is happening. And so I think in some sense that argument against those transactional logics of mitigating the worst effects of climate change, of which I see rising heat, deforestation, and toxified atmospheres as climate change, right? I think that is a kind of decolonial move in the sense that, Restrepo and Escobar talk about the decolonial as sort of thinking about the ways in which capitalism reproduces and perpetuates colonial forms of extraction. So I think I'll stop there and see if anybody else has any questions. But thank you so much, Ashanté. Those are brilliant comments, and it's going to be so helpful for me as I develop this. Oh, we got to do, yeah. I was using one of these microphones in one of my classes the other day, and I was trying, started talking about Donahue and Sally Jesse Raphael, and I couldn't think of a talk show host that any of my students had ever heard of as I was trying to go through the crowd of the thing. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much for your. Okay, thank you so much for your talk and for the really excellent comments by Professor Reese. I sort of have a sort of a follow-up question. I think it was sort of implicit in your conversation, but I want to tease it out. Like as I was hearing you talk, the Sarah Horton's book, Their Kidneys in the Field, really came to mind. And I think that like that as a particular type of racialized labor regime in the United States really shows how the condition of farm workers is structured by, like migration and how that is carried out on people's bodies. But I was thinking, in my own work, I've been thinking about how to think racial capitalism in Mexico, so like not in the United States. And so I guess that I'm interested sort of in this like emerging sort of set of discussions around the plantation as a way to think the emergence of capitalism and its sort of continuation into the present around, so I guess maybe just the question of like, what does it mean to think the plantation in Nicaragua specifically? And then I'm also interested, this is maybe just a different interest, but sort of the work, the sort of like ambivalent work of these scientists, right? Like on one hand, recognizing these diseases as occupational diseases and maybe producing knowledge that is, generally applicable at all sorts of places. But then also this sort of like ameliorative or sort of like, and where there's like sort of a political engagement with knowledge production, this sort of like positivist knowledge production by like epidemiologists or people studying kidney enzymes or whatever.
Great, thanks, Sam. So yeah, I mean, if I could have made a lot more and should have made a lot more references. So when I talk about disposability, I'm definitely drawing on Sarah Horton's work. This is the work that she's done on the development of labor-related diseases, including probably the same disease among workers in the California fruit industry. And she was able to do field work sort of with laborers, not unlike Seth Holmes and other anthropologists did this kind of thing, right? And in my research, for a variety of reasons, and this maybe gets back to the batik question. Like, I didn't actually do field work. I didn't try to go see what it was like to cut cane. Right? I felt like I wanted to kind of look at this problem much as the kind of movement that I was involved with was looking at it, which is really from the margins of the plantation, and so. So that's one of the kind of differences. And I think the reason why thinking the plantation matters gets back to something that Ashanté brought up as well, when you brought up the gender question, right? Which is that in addition to being a system of monocrop production that, I mean, the way I would see it is that it's a system of monocrop production that relies upon racialized and gender, the enforcement of racialized and gender differences between people while constantly making gestures to disavow that difference making, right? And so the modern day, like what Mintz and Wolf would have called like the new style plantation in Latin America was defined by this attempt to sort of sever the industry from the community, right? And that was their heuristic, right? The old style plantation was this embedded kind of thing, and then this new style plantation became more like the factory, right? And it never really worked, right? Because not only do people have some sense that it's more than that, but also there's all of this labor that's never counted in GDP, and certainly not on the books of plantations, that allows it to perpetuate itself. And not just the reproductive labor of nurturing workers when they're exhausted and injured in the fields, but also the work of doing the kinds of things that I talked about briefly, like marshaling family resources to petition governments or petition the company for care. So I think a big part of what we maybe learn about in terms of racial capitalism in the broadest sense, right, is the way in which it engineers certain kinds of care and silences other kinds of care. And so this segues into the science question. The most active CKD&T scientists do consider themselves to be very engaged types of folks, right? And the frame in which they talk about this disease is really twofold. One is, for many of them, this is an emerging planetary health problem, right? There is a strong sense that this is something that's happened, or at least it's become noticeable because of rising temperatures and everything that I talked about earlier. But they also come to it from the global health and sort of humanitarian frame. They want to save lives, first and foremost. And in fact, they get a lot of traction from donors and from funders by saying, here's how many workers won't contract this disease if we do these, for example, these water rest shade experiments. So what that does is it allows them to show the all-important metrics of difference making, right, that matter in global health, right? It allows them to position themselves sort of in the vanguard of this new science of planetary health. And it also allows them, and in some ways requires them, to make scientific cases about causality. So the scientists that are doing this, I think, really innovative and important occupational epidemiology by trying to show that you can protect workers by providing water, rest, and shade, are also writing articles that are not just saying heat is the most important thing to pay attention to, but actively saying toxic chemicals are present, but we can't measure them, and it doesn't matter because workers report low exposures at work to toxic chemicals. So that means that this doesn't matter, right? The fact that a helicopter might fly over loaded with glyphosate to ripen this stand of cane and then kill all the crops that are in the back of this house doesn't matter to occupational scientists because this is an occupation, right? So in some ways, the science itself is built around the idea of the occupational space, which comes from the factory, right? And then into the bargain, they get buy-in from companies by proving, and they proved it based on their metrics, that if you provide these kinds of protections to active workers who are still active and not yet sick, they'll actually be more efficient. You'll save money. You'll get more for your dollar that you pay to those workers if you allow them to rest. So then companies love it, right? They're getting certified by Bon Sucro and these other kind of multi-stakeholder organizations as ethical, right? And science can happen, right? When this first started, companies were sending the police to arrest people who tried to talk about it, right? Now they're inviting scientists then to protect their workers, right? So there's this way in which it looks a certain way from a certain kind of perspective, and from the perspective of science, right? This is a vitally important thing, right? They've counted up, the number of victims, and this is bigger than Ebola. This is bigger than, a lot of the things that make the news, right? Bigger than Zika and that kind of thing. And nobody's paying attention, so we need to kind of make this, the way to make this something that the world pays attention to is to make it this occupational disease where right-thinking companies are partnering with right-thinking scientists to save lives. All of the surplus gets cut out of that. And that's, that's how you make a laboratory in the field, right?
Thank you. Could you show me the
of Nicaragua where this is?
Yeah. I hope you can see it. I made it really
Yes,
small.
I'm just wondering whether this is blue fields or is it the Caribbean coast or not, because, I mean, sugarcane is mostly coastal in here.
This is the Pacific coastal plain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the Pacific side,
The Pacific
not the
side.
Caribbean side.
Yeah, so this, Montelimar is just about southwest of Manila.
I'll
Yeah.
rest my case, because on the other side as well, where you have Afro-Caribbean and indigenous population, right? So that's also the Caribbean side as well, right? I mean, this is, and one wonders whether the population is not sort of mestizo, right? And it's, I mean, on the other side, of course, it's English speaking and blue fields and so, and that also sort of complicates bodies,
Yes.
right? And how these things are sort of worked out. So anyway, this may be a mestizo or a Latino population, but there is indigenous as well.
Yes. So in this side of, in the Pacific side of Nicaragua, there are people who identify as indigenous. Yes. One of the first places where the movement to address the broad environmental harms of sugarcane production, which are not just about this one disease, right, which are about crop loss, which are about respiratory disease, and a whole bunch of stuff. The first, really, the place where that started was in an indigenous Sutiaba community just north of Leon, which is surrounded by NSCL sugarcane plantations.
So, yeah, go ahead, you finish your thought.
And so the Sutiabas actually initially were signatories to the first grievance that was filed before the CAO against NSCL in 2008. By the time the CAO decided to hear it and produce a mediation between people who were affected and between the complainant and between the companies, the Sutiabas were no longer signatories. There's a lot of theories about why that happened.
But there's also a longer history of even the Sandinistas and the collectivization process, right? And how the indigenous were sort of, or even the Afro-Caribbean population, the kind of way that your how would you say the campesinistas,
yeah.
Right? They were sort of very much into a certain kind of collectivization of mode in which there was resistance from the indigenous communities and also. So that's an older history. But of course, if you look at sugar production in Brazil or in the sort of para-Caribbean area, you see it more in Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Brazilian population. So I have two just side things. One, the whole issue that you are talking about, of course, the 80% of informal labor, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is, I mean, it was always true, but now more true in the global south. So the issue of protective regimes through industries, whether it is housing, whether it is health, whether it is food security, whether it is schooling, that kind of myth of sort of social change, of progressive social change, is, of course, being exposed here as well. So the issue is, and of course, we all sort of, at least I marched for Daniel Ortega in 1985, but we know that how that whole regime has been changed and a new kind of politics. I'm not saying state is out of it, but a new kind of politics in which these guarantees cannot be through the factory.
Right.
Right? I mean, there's a whole sort of way, and I think this is the sort of the macro way in which perhaps one will have to start thinking that how do we get protective regimes for the worker? Because whether there are public hospitals in this particular case, in most places in Global South, even that doesn't exist. So what kind of guarantees, because right now what you're saying exactly is that less and less people will be protected through the factory, through the conglomerate, through the industry. And for one pretext or the other, whether it is high creatinine or something else, they will be off that and they'll be contractual. And they won't be sort of part of that. So I think that's where the issue of politics and the future, what you were talking about, is sort of important for perhaps all of us to think through. The final thing was that sort of that beyond capitalism issue. And I was thinking about, and I introduced myself a little bit to you, about a very old article from 1956 that Eric Wolf and Sidney Mills wrote about Compadrazgo. Mm-hmm. And they worked in the coffee plantation and the sugarcane and industrial sugarcane in Puerto Rico. And basically they were talking about how outside the regime of formal protections, the way in which social relations and kin networks sort of create ways of some kind of subsidy, some kind of protection. So I was wondering if you would sort of elaborate on that, because that would be important outside the issue of the, how should I say, ethnic and the racial makeup of this population? Thanks.
Yeah, so the way in which social protections are kind of reinforced and ensured through kinship, I mean, it's really, you know, what makes Nicaragua fascinating is the fairly rapid sort of ebb and flow of land tenure sovereignty, you know, within indigenous communities, right, who did have to sort of fight to claw to get their land back during and after the revolution, and Somoza had his own way of dealing with groups like that, and then during the revolution and then afterwards. So you have family groups that that work in these industries who own land that's not ancestral, right? And many of whom have claims to sort of parcels of land that either came from wartime concessions, right, or maybe descend from other kinds of things. And so they're, the importance of working that land, right, is in some ways shared and reinforced through kin connections across generations. So it's not just that kin connections provide a stream of labor in the Cabra example that I used, but also that kin connections allow people to who have been moved around and displaced, right? Somoza used the National Guard to kick people off of good land and that sort of thing, to sort of reestablish a sense of belonging. So in the context of this kind of sort of environmental violence, that becomes really important, because one of the things that, you know, gets said sometimes in not in official kind of company decrees, but when people complain about things like pesticide drift, or they complain about lack of access to water, they will say, well, you know, now you have formal title to your land in the village, you could just sell it and move to the city. And so one of the things that this workers movement, the AMBED movement, the Asociación Montelima Bendición de Dios, tries to do is the really difficult work of establishing that people actually want to remain in these places, despite the fact that they seem like the least desirable places to live, right? And the reason is that that's where relationships exist, and that's where kind of, even though sons and daughters may go and work in the city, you know, and all those sorts of things, it matters that they maintain those sorts of connections, right? And it also, there's no other way to do this kind of, you know, sort of social mobilization other than to draw on those kinds of networks. Now, at the same time, they're not entirely always harmonious. Like any movement, there's infighting and debate. You know, I've chosen not really to talk too much about that in my written work, because I think actually what's important is the broad way in which this movement operates, rather than the kind of its particulars. I actually don't really even think they think of themselves as activists. I think they think of themselves as comunidad, and that's really as much as anything what they're fighting for. I wanted to say one more thing about the Caribbean versus the Atlantic. The sugarcane boom in Nicaragua that's happened through World Bank loans and that sort of thing started right before Ortega took office again in 2007. So the last thing that the president before him, Enrique Bolaños, did, he was a total like cotton guy and pesticide guy. The last thing he did was to sign this executive order saying that the economic priority for the government with agriculture was the creation of bioenergy. And in the West Coast, it was going to be sugarcane. And in the Atlantic Coast, it's oil palm. So what's one of the things that's happening in the Atlantic Coast that's really, really been devastating for indigenous communities is the government's initiative, supported by the World Bank, this exact same loaning mechanism, to convert traditional land that might have been used for other kinds of commercial purposes, but probably also as traditional land, to oil palm cultivation in the name of bioenergy. So those communities are being affected by that, and the cattle ranching industry. So there's a person called Josh Mayer, who got a PhD from UCLA, that's been working on that side of things, an anthropologist that's doing some really, really important work around that issue.
I'm a human rights lawyer teaching at the law school, and so I don't have one of these epistemological questions. I have more concrete questions. One of the things when I studied this work on this issue like 10 years ago, it was very interesting to see that the state controlled the situation in different ways. It was one, direct violence, I mean the police present. That was one. There was the labor department controlling the labor conditions, and then the social security, like, or the nine. So it looks like, and of course, then the agreement between Ortega as the owners of the sugar companies, that they reach an agreement because of Ortega's control over the unions, the corruption of the unions. So it appears that the situation is much more complex, and the state is present in many different ways than just social security.
Yes.
It's a different way of exercising control over the workers. So that's, if you can explain more on that. The other is, when I studied it was very interesting to see that the causation was a critical question. And today you say, well, it's not that important, and at least we move away from that. I'm not so clear that is true, and I would like more explanation.
Okay.
At that point, it was very clear that unless we prove causation, nothing would fly. And it appears to be a discussion between American scientists and American universities producing different types of expert reports whether or not there was causation.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that universities and American scientists were making ton of money just to say yes or no.
Yeah.
Probably say no causation, more money than say yes causation.
Yeah.
But that's a different aspect. And the final one was the certification. Because as far as I understand, the certification, at least during those years, we're looking only at the situation of the former workers, those who were directly hired by sugar companies, not the subcontractors.
Yes.
So they would get the certification, and the 5 workers on the formal labor contracts, they would get their suits and gloves and the water breaks and all that, but the vast majority wouldn't take anything. However, the companies would get the certificate.
Right.
So I don't know if you can unpack a little bit more all these.
I think I can try. So the state interventions question is a really good one. I mean, the murkiness of where the Ortega money goes. I mean, there's the legend around Montelimar is that one of the partners of Nading is the Ortega family. They own a lot of land around there. In fact, another one of the leaders of this workers group, his little parcela where he grew his corn was right across from Rosario Murillo's beachside farm, where she's, legend has it she will build a nice place for her kids to go to the beach, right? So this is, and it also, of course, it's thoroughly entangled with the history of the state, right? Because it was a state farm, one, but this particular farm was also the Somoza land, right? So all of the infrastructure was built when the Somozas were essentially the state, whether or not a Somoza was the president, as there was in 1979. So in the sense that like it became a state farm in that kind of semi-socialist sense, that was just sort of one step in that direction. Unions, union corruption, you want to call it corruption, or just sort of the ownership of unions by a combination of companies and parties makes them a non-entity really in this conversation. And they matter probably as much to the field management level. That's where a lot of that power lies. And so this was never really a barricade the gates of the Ingenio kind of movement, right? It doesn't look like a labor movement in that sense. And I think also that the government has benefited in some ways from this issue happening where it's happening, right? In a place where during 2018, you had very low rates of sort of participation and unrest in these rural areas. It was León, it was Managua, it was the cities and towns, right? And because people were invested in it, but they couldn't afford to be in that kind of way. And there are many people who are supporters of Daniel, because let's face it, when he came into office in 2007, healthcare was more expensive, kids weren't staying in school because it was too expensive, and a lot of actually pretty good things happened for the poor in that first 5 years of the Ortega regime. And so there's a lot of ambivalence around that. Causation does matter. I think the point that I'd like to try to reinforce is that because we know that this disease happens in places that aren't sugarcane fields, there are, I collected dozens of accounts from women, for example, who either very rarely worked in the cane or never worked in the cane, who have CKD&T, right? Whose disease won't ever be classified in that way. And their claim is based on the generalized environmental degradation that's around them, right? So that the causal problem is not work, it's production, right? It's not the conditions of work. It's like what Ashanté was saying about the working conditions, right? That then leak into people's lives. So that's what the scientists, I think, have had trouble figuring out how to look at. And that's not a unique story when it comes to environmental damage. Certifications, you're absolutely right about that. So NSEL, the company that produced Flor de Caña, is certified fair trade. That's as much an issue of Fair Trade USA being willing to certify pretty much anything, but also because of the way in which the subcontractors are sort of hidden. The thing that's really that's really saving sugarcane in the sort of ethical trade space is not fair trade. It's Bonsucro, which is slightly different. It's the industry's own multi-stakeholder organization that's taking up the sort of best practices that come from some of these early studies of water, rest, and shade and making that a pretext for ethical sugar certification. And so Bonsucro is sort of attempting to make it okay to continue to produce industrial sugar however it can. I think that I haven't looked into it enough, but one of the things, of course, that they're doing is coming up with really neat ways for people to calculate their environmental impact. So as these ethanol and biogeneration sort of projects come out, right, what they're able to do is to say that they're offsetting the damage or the impact of pesticide use through the use of bagasse, which is the sugarcane pulp, for cogeneration of energy in the plants. So they're using less coal, less petroleum-based energy. And then they can come up, they have metric sort of algorithms that they can come up and show that sugarcane companies in Nicaragua and elsewhere are moving more towards carbon neutrality, so that they then can position themselves not as perpetrators of climate change, but as potential victims of climate change. And I think that's a really brilliant business strategy, because it really appeals to the ethical consumer, right, to be able to say this is the ethically produced product versus this is the non-ethically produced product. But the math on it is quite, is not only in terms of who gets counted as a worker, but also what gets counted as an environmental impact is very, very creative.
Alex, thanks for that talk. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to return to the early part of the talk and ask the theoretical devil's advocate question. I think there's, I found your argument about the plantation being the space which causes sort of category confusion in terms of what's the role of labor, and is it a patrimonial system or a bureaucratic system, really compelling. And I wonder if you could draw, this is more of a question about asking you to draw the implications of that analysis for this kind of more capitalist frame that you're asking us to think in. Why should we not think that kind of relationship is not just some sort of kind of cruel optimism that is sort of an ideological artifact that allows for the means of reproduction? The notion that, the notion that maybe there's somebody in the plantation system who will act in a patrimonial way,
yeah,
as opposed to being the coal.
I think you could I think you could call it that. I think that, like, this was sort of my my sort of cagey attempt to get it to converse with people like Graeber and Gupta, who've talked a lot about the ways in which bureaucratic violence happens through that arbitrariness of classification at the level of the abstract technocratic judgment of of deservingness that tries to cut away those. I guess what I was saying is that, like, equally arbitrary is the mobilization of those, what Graeber, I think, sort of romantically calls like egalitarian social relations, right? As if there was some time or some place in which it would have been a given that somebody who was a good manager would have given you an easy off ramp into retirement or something like that. So I think it is like the cruelty of it, or the violence of it, is that they're being beset by the arbitrary decisions, not just at the level of bureaucracy, which is to some extent always arbitrary, right? And in which no single person, although people do manage in some ways to get single people to make to change decisions and that sort of thing, but they're also being beset by a kind of arbitrary kind of beneficence or largesse from the company, and so I think that expectation. It's cruel options, but it's also kind of a cruel nostalgia, because I really think that the invocation of the figure of the patron, for example, is a political move, right? It's forcing the company to either accept or disavow that potential role for itself, right? Or the manager to do that, and it's drawing on memories that people don't necessarily even directly have, right? I mean, and this is true in lots of these kinds of situations. I mean, people will be nostalgic for back when Somoza ran things and this and that, like partly as a critique, right? And so I think there's a way in which it's not, like, I'm not sure that people are thinking about, I mean, they're going to die, right? They're thinking about how they're going to die. And so I guess I would say it's a little bit of trouble sort of thinking about what the optimism would be, because it's really about, for a guy like the guy I called William in this talk, right, to secure slightly better treatment is really about figuring out a better way to die. And in the book I talk about, those who do get these benefits, right, and the company does actually help people get to dialysis. They have a bus that takes people to dialysis, right? This is sort of the last cruel joke, is that, like, they've sort of, like, the management of death, right? That sort of necropolitics of the plantation that Mbembe talks about and stuff, right? Means that your very last days are sort of written into the sort of management, algorithm of how you run a plantation. So they'll get on this bus in shifts to go to Managua to get their dialysis, right? Spread out across the city. And that same bus on its little recorrido will pick up managers who live in Managua to take them to work in the office, and then pick up the next wave of patients for dialysis. And so they're just sort of rotated. They've even ridden on buses on the top of which are jugs of, gigantic sort of vats of chemicals, or even sugarcane, right? So they sort of are experiencing death through the logics of management, which they very much consider to be a deepening of the violence, especially as the company refuses things like allowing wives, sisters, aunts to ride along on the bus and accompany them through dialysis. So there's been a lot of that happening. So I think that that sort of, I guess I don't think that the ethic of this movement is an optimistic one, because again, I don't really think it's an activist movement. I'm not sure what they're not trying to shut down the plantation. They're trying to get attention to problems that they think are worthy of attention. But I think in some ways they're refusing to take responsibility that they have, in that sort of idea that Pavanelli has, that they have the opportunity, that they have the obligation to come up with something better, right? So I think that's kind of where they are.
More questions?
Well, if not, then maybe everybody can join me in thanking Alex for a really fantastic.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.